The American Yawp, Chapter 9, Getting Forward. Section 3, The Politics of Jacksonian America. On May 30, 1806, Andrew Jackson, a 39-year-old Tennessee lawyer, came within inches of death. A duelist's bullet struck him in the chest, just shy of his heart. The man who fired the gun was purportedly the best shot in Tennessee. But the wounded Jackson remained standing. Bleeding, he slowly steadied his aim and returned fire. The other man dropped to the ground, mortally wounded. Jackson, still carrying the bullet in his chest, later boasted, "I should have hit him if he had shot me through the brain." This duel in Logan County, Kentucky, was one of many that Jackson fought during his long and highly controversial career. The tenacity, toughness, and vengefulness that kept Jackson alive in that duel, and the mythology and symbolism that would be attached to it, would also characterize many of his later dealings on the battlefield and in politics. By the time of his death almost 40 years later, Andrew Jackson became an enduring and controversial symbol of the ways that various Americans thought about their changing country. For better and worse, he would embody the meanings of American-style democracy. Democratic ideals. Today, despite some wavering in recent years, most Americans think democracy is a good thing. They tend to assume the nation's early political leaders believed the same. Wasn't the American Revolution a victory for democratic principles? For many of the founders, however, the clear answer had been no. To be sure, a wide variety of people had participated in early U.S. politics, especially at the local level. But ordinary citizens' growing direct influence on government after the Revolution had frightened the founding elites. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Alexander Hamilton had warned about the vices of democracy and admitted that he considered the British government, with its powerful king and parliament, the best in the world. Another convention delegate, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, who eventually refused to sign the finished Constitution, had agreed. "The evils we experience," he proclaimed, "flow from an excess of democracy. Too much participation by the multitudes," these founding elite had believed, would undermine good order. It would prevent the creation of a secure and united Republican society. Such warnings, though, had done nothing to quell Americans' democratic impulses in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. During these decades, Americans who were allowed to vote, and sometimes those who weren't, went to the polls in impressive numbers. They also made public demonstrations. They delivered partisan speeches on patriotic holidays. They petitioned Congress, openly criticized the president, and insisted that free people should not defer even to elected leaders. In many people's eyes, the American Republic was a democratic republic. The people were sovereign all the time, not only on election day. For all their misgivings, elite leaders of political parties could not afford to overlook the cultivation of popular favor, as Alexander Hamilton put it. Between the 1790s and 1830s, the elite of every state and party learned to listen, or pretend to listen, to the voices of the multitude. And an American president, holding the federal office that most resembles a king's, would come to symbolize the democratizing spirit of American politics. The career of Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845, the survivor of that backcountry Kentucky duel in 1806, exemplified both the opportunities and the dangers of political life in the early republic. A lawyer, enslaver, and military commander, and eventually the 7th President of the United States, he rose from humble frontier beginnings to become one of the most powerful Americans of the 19th century. Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 on the border between North and South Carolina to two immigrants from Northern Ireland. He grew up during a dangerous time. At age 13, he joined an American militia unit in the Revolutionary War. He was soon captured, and a British officer slashed at his head with a sword when he refused to shine the officer's shoes. Wartime disease claimed the lives of Jackson's two brothers and his mother, leaving him an orphan. Their deaths and his wounds left Jackson with a deep and abiding hatred of Great Britain. After the war, Jackson moved west to frontier Tennessee, where, despite his poor education, he prospered and made himself into a Southern gentleman, working as a lawyer and acquiring land and enslaved laborers. He would eventually come to keep 150 people enslaved at the Hermitage, his plantation near Nashville. In 1796, Jackson was elected as a U.S. representative, and a year later he won a seat in the Senate, although he resigned within a year, citing financial difficulties. Jackson's significance in American history might have ended there, but, thanks to his political connections, he obtained a general's commission at the outbreak of the War of 1812. Despite having no combat experience, General Jackson quickly impressed his troops, who nicknamed him Old Hickory, after a particularly tough kind of tree. Jackson led his militiamen into battle in the southeast, first during the Creek War, a side conflict that started between different factions of Muskogee Creek fighters in present-day Alabama. In that war, he won a decisive victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. A year later, he also defeated a large British invasion force at the Battle of New Orleans. There, Jackson's motley crew of fighters, including backwoods militiamen, free African Americans, Native Americans, and a company of slave-trading pirates, successfully defended the city and inflicted more than 2,000 casualties against the British, sustaining barely 300 casualties of their own. Despite the fact that the battle occurred after a peace treaty had been signed, Jackson gained wide acclaim throughout the United States. The end of the War of 1812 did not finish Jackson's military career, however. In 1818, as commander of the U.S. Southern Military District, the hero of New Orleans also launched an invasion of Spanish-owned Florida. He was acting on vague orders from the War Department to break the resistance of the region's Seminole people, who sheltered black refugees from slavery and attacked American settlers from across the border. Jackson oversaw several atrocities during this conflict. On his orders in 1816, U.S. soldiers and their Creek allies had already destroyed the Negro Fort, a British-built stronghold on Spanish soil, killing 270 formerly enslaved people and executing some survivors. Now, in 1818, Jackson's troops crossed the border again. They occupied Pensacola, the main Spanish town in the region, and arrested 2 British subjects, whom Jackson promptly executed for helping the Seminoles. The execution of these 2 Britons, combined with the dubious legality of invading Spanish territory in the first place, created a diplomatic crisis. Most officials in President James Monroe's administration called for Jackson's censure. But the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, found Jackson's behavior useful. He defended the impulsive general, arguing that he had been forced to act. Adams used Jackson's military successes in this First Seminole War to pressure Spain to accept the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, which gave Florida to the United States. Any friendliness between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, however, did not last long. The elections of 1824 and 1828. In 1824, 4 nominees competed for the presidency in one of the closest elections in American history. Conspicuously, the leading candidates represented different major sections of the country. The Northerner John Quincy Adams came from Massachusetts, the Southerner William H. Crawford came from Georgia, and 2 Westerners, Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, hailed from Tennessee and Kentucky. All but Crawford were favored sons nominated by their state legislatures rather than by a National Party caucus. Jackson had by far the least experience in Washington, but despite that, or perhaps because of it, he won the most popular votes. Still, there was no majority winner in the Electoral College, so the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. There, John Quincy Adams used his political clout to claim the presidency, persuading Henry Clay to support him. After his election, Adams named Clay to serve as Secretary of State, a powerful role that had often served as a step to the presidency. Jackson would never forgive Adams, whom his supporters accused of engineering a, quote, corrupt bargain with Clay to circumvent the people's will. 4 years later, in 1828, Adams and Jackson squared off in one of the dirtiest presidential elections to date. Pro-Jackson partisans accused the Harvard-educated Adams of elitism, and they claimed that while serving in Russia as a diplomat, he had offered the Russian emperor the services of an American sex worker. Adams's supporters, on the other hand, accused Jackson of murder and attacked the morality of his marriage, pointing out that Jackson had married his wife Rachel under murky circumstances before her divorce from a prior husband was complete. Despite the bitter attacks, Andrew Jackson won the election easily. But Rachel Jackson, with her reputation in tatters, died suddenly before his inauguration. Jackson would never forgive the people who attacked his wife's character during the campaign. For both supporters and opponents, Jackson was a potent symbol of the changes that were happening in America. To supporters, he was Old Hickory, the hero of New Orleans, a leader of plain frontier folk. His wartime accomplishments appealed to their pride. Over the next 8 years, he would claim to represent the interests of ordinary white Americans, especially from the South and West, against the country's wealthy and powerful northeastern elite. This attitude would lead him and his allies into a series of bitter political struggles. In the process, Jacksonian politics would erode freedom for African Americans and Native Americans, even as it expanded some freedoms for poor white people. Worker protests. During the early 19th century, many Americans grew uneasy with the stark gap between wage laborers and wealthy businessmen. Elite men like Daniel Webster might defend their wealth and privilege by insisting that all workers could achieve a career of usefulness and enterprise if they were merely industrious and sober. But labor activists like Seth Luther countered that capitalism created a cruel system of extraction on the bodies and minds of the producing classes, for no other object than to enable the rich to take care of themselves while the poor must work or starve. Wage work had traditionally been disdained as a state of dependence. It was considered suitable only as a temporary waypoint for young men on their path toward the economic success necessary to support a wife and children. But now it was often a permanent condition. Hierarchy was always evident. Employers had both financial security and political power, while employees faced uncertainty and powerlessness in the workplace. In this environment, even people who had already gotten forward could not feel secure. Depressions and downturns, such as the stunning panic of 1819, might destroy businesses and throw their owners into wage work. Even in times of prosperity, male workers might lack good wages or economic security, and therefore might need to depend on supplemental income from their wives and young children. Dependent on the whims of their employers, some workers, like the Lowell Mill girls, turned to unions to pool their resources, threatening to strike for better wages and working conditions. In 1825, a group of journeymen in Boston formed a carpenters' union to protest their inability to maintain a family at the present time, with the wages which are now usually given. Working men organized unions to assert themselves and win both the respect and the resources due to a breadwinner and a citizen. Managers, owners, and civic leaders thought these unions inflamed a dangerous and unnecessary antagonism between capital and labor. They responded by promoting an ideal of social mobility, justifying their own economic privilege as the natural product of superior character traits and hard work. One group of master carpenters, for example, denounced their striking journeymen in 1825 with the claim that workers of industrious and temperate habits have, in their turn, become thriving and respectable masters, and the great body of our mechanics have been enabled to acquire property and respectability with a just weight and influence in society. In other words, they claimed you could always get ahead if you worked hard. This claim did not always match the experience of wage earners. Indeed, beyond the whims of employers, some workers believed they knew another specific culprit for the economic turmoil in their lives: the banks. Banking. During the Transportation Revolution, state legislatures pumped capital into infrastructure projects by issuing corporate charters to banks. A corporate charter allowed investors and directors to avoid personal liability for a company's debts, and legislatures often granted this privilege, along with certain monopoly rights, to promote investment in expensive and risky projects. The number of state-chartered banks in America skyrocketed from just one in 1783 to 266 in 1820 to 702 in 1840 to 1,371 in 1860. European finance also contributed to American infrastructure. By 1844, one British traveler declared that the prosperity of America, her railroads, canals, steam navigation, and banks, are the fruit of English capital. The business corporation was still unfamiliar in the daily lives of most people, and many Americans distrusted these strange, impersonal, and potentially foreign business organizations. Corporate officers, they feared, lacked personal responsibility for their actions, and worse, had been given authority that should belong only to representatives of the people. Many Americans sensed a potential conspiracy to consolidate power outside the elected government. In 1816, Thomas Jefferson himself wrote that Americans should crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. A group of journeymen cordwainers, shoemakers, in New Jersey publicly declared in 1835 that they entirely disapproved of the incorporation of companies for carrying on manual mechanical business, inasmuch as we believe their tendency is to eventuate and produce monopolies, thereby crippling the energies of individual enterprise. But in Dartmouth versus Woodward, 1819, the Supreme Court upheld the rights of private corporations, blocking an attempt by the government of New Hampshire to reorganize Dartmouth College. Andrew Jackson's political supporters included many Americans who blamed the special privileges of these moneyed corporations, especially state-chartered banks, for the unevenness of economic prosperity. Above all, they blamed the banks for promoting dangerous speculation. Major depressions struck the economy in 1819, 1837, and 1857. Each followed rampant speculation in various commodities: land in 1819, land and enslaved laborers in 1837, and railroad bonds in 1857. The banks were suspect for another reason as well. The banknotes they issued seemed inherently fraudulent to many Americans. These paper certificates were not technically money, but which circulated as if they were, passed around from buyer to seller to employee before eventually being presented to the bank for payment in coins. Printed in vast quantities by private firms, banknotes untethered the economy from tangible forms of wealth that seemed more reliable. Paper was no substitute for cold, hard metal, gold, silver, or copper. If a bank failed, its bills became worthless. Many bills weren't even issued by the banks that had their names on them. Counterfeits were everywhere. With so many fake bills circulating, Americans were constantly on the lookout for the confidence man, or con man for short, and other deceptive characters. Just as false banknotes could pass as real in the national market, con men and women could circulate through communities, winning the trust of regular, honest Americans. Middle-class culture, always uneasy about the morality of the commercial economy, reacted with horror. Advice literature offered young people strategies for avoiding hypocrisy. Intimacy in the domestic sphere became more important as duplicity proliferated in the public sphere. And even as Americans kept pushing to get forward, many looked for spiritual renewal. Section 4. The Second Great Awakening. In the early 19th century, a succession of Protestant Christian religious movements, collectively known as the Second Great Awakening, remade the nation's religious landscape. Preachers traveled on horseback and spoke to crowds outdoors, sharing a message of spiritual and moral revival. Residents of towns, rural farmlands, and frontier territories alike flocked to huge religious revival meetings, where intense physical and emotional enthusiasm accompanied evangelical conversion experiences. These revivals contributed to movements for social change, which sometimes endured long after the revival meetings were over. Under the leadership of preachers and ministers, reform societies attacked many social problems. Believers concerned about the harms of alcohol could join temperance societies. Other groups focused on eradicating dueling and gambling. Evangelical reformers might have supported home or foreign missionary work, or Bible and tract societies that distributed Christian literature. Sabbatarians fought tirelessly to end non-religious activity on Sunday, the Christian Sabbath. Moral reform societies sought to end prostitution and redeem its fallen women. Across the early 19th century, voluntary associations and benevolent activists also worked to reform bankruptcy laws, prison systems, mental hospitals, labor laws, and education. They built orphanages and free medical dispensaries and developed programs to provide social work, job placement, and day camps for children in city slums. The Second Great Awakening was an expression of powerful intellectual and social currents in American life. Outdoor camp meetings, attended by people from all classes, captured the democratizing spirit of the American Revolution, but at the same time, they provided a unifying moral order and new sense of spiritual community for Americans uneasy with the great changes of the day. The camp meeting, held in close contact with nature, where believers meeting under a forest canopy might seal their conversions with full immersion river baptisms, reflected the anxiety many felt about urban industrial society. As the market revolution, Western expansion, and European immigration, especially the arrival of large numbers of Catholic Christians, all challenged traditional bonds of authority, Protestant Christian evangelicalism promised equal measures of excitement and order. By the 1820s, religious revivals were spreading across the United States, swelling church membership, spawning new Protestant denominations, and inspiring social reform. Unlike most long-established churches, which required ministers to have some formal theological training, growing alternatives like the Methodists, who had organized their American denomination the year after the Revolution ended, required only a conversion experience and a supernatural call to preach. This meant that a 20-year-old man could practically overnight go from working in a mill to being a full-time circuit-riding preacher for the Methodists. Thus, the evangelical denominations attracted more new preachers to send into the field, and the lack of formal education meant their preachers could be paid significantly less than a pastor with a divinity degree might expect. It also sometimes meant these movements had a place, albeit a separate place, for enslaved and free black preachers, and evangelical religious life became increasingly important to African American communities during these decades. Because of the economic forces of the market revolution, middle-class evangelicals caught up in the revival movements also had the time and resources to devote to reform campaigns. Often, their reforms focused on creating and maintaining respectable middle-class culture throughout the United States. Evangelical women who were active in the revivals also played a leading role in reform activity. They became increasingly responsible for the moral maintenance of their homes and communities, and their leadership signaled a dramatic departure from previous generations, when such prominent public roles for ordinary women would have been unthinkable. Though deep ideological and theological disagreements divided Protestant Christians into many different sects, church leaders often worked on an interdenominational basis to establish benevolent societies and draw their followers into the work of social reform. These non-denominational Christian societies became a powerful cultural force, sometimes known as the benevolent empire. Temperance. Among all the social reform movements associated with the benevolent empire, the Temperance Crusade was perhaps the most successful. Championed by prominent preachers like Lyman Beecher, the movement's effort to curb the consumption of alcohol galvanized widespread support among the middle class. Alcohol consumption had become a significant social issue after the American Revolution. Commercial distilleries produced whiskey that was frequently more affordable than milk or beer and safer than water, and hard liquor became a staple beverage in many households. Consumption among adults skyrocketed in the early 19th century, and alcoholism became an endemic problem across the United States by the 1820s. As alcoholism became more visible, most reformers escalated their efforts, switching from advocating moderation in liquor consumption to demanding full abstinence from all alcohol. They saw a direct correlation between alcohol and other forms of vice. Most importantly, they felt that it endangered family life. In 1826, evangelical ministers organized the American Temperance Society to lead the National Crusade. The ATS supported lecture campaigns, produced temperance literature, and organized Christian revival specifically aimed at encouraging worshipers to give up the drink. The ATS was so successful that within a decade, it established 5,000 branches and grew to over 1 million members. Temperance reformers pledged not to touch the bottle and canvassed their neighborhoods and towns to encourage other people to join their cold water army. They also influenced lawmakers in several states to prohibit the sale of liquor, associating heavy drinking with men who abused, abandoned, or neglected their families. Middle-class women formed a significant presence in the temperance societies. But their movement threatened to intrude on the private lives of lower-class workers, many of whom were Irish Catholics and families of recent immigrants. These moral attacks by the Protestant middle class thus exacerbated class, ethnic, and religious tensions. Still, the movement was a great success for reformers. In the 1840s, Americans drank half of what they had in the 1820s, and per capita consumption continued to decline over the next 2 decades. The benevolent empire's potent combination of social reform and evangelical piety produced agendas and institutional changes that have reverberated through the 20th and 21st centuries. By devoting their time to the moral uplift of their communities and the world in general, middle-class reformers in the 19th century created many of the largest and most influential organizations in the nation's history. For the optimistic, religiously motivated American, no problem seemed too great to solve. No problem, that is, except one.